Shalom and bracha, everyone. A good ben shiur, gemach tova. Bez Hashem, we want to continue the shiurim on Daled Minim to see how different it is today with the abundance of Daled Minim compared to the earlier generations. All along, how the dairies that they weren't able to obtain Kosher Daled Minim. So last year we spoke about Daled Minim Beklal, how they used to buy Daled Minim with the whole community together, used to chip up a Daled Minim. There would be a few shuls, they used to chip it together. And the Ramah says that the Oisher would give according to his Ashiris, and the Ani would give according to his Anias. It wasn't clear cut how much everyone gave, but everyone gave in accordance to what they had. And that's how they raised a substantial sum of money in order to buy the Daled Minim. That's how expensive it was. It was unbelievably expensive, and that's how poor the people were. They couldn't afford the esrog. They had to chip in, just like today we make a fund, GoFundMe, or all different types of appeals to get people to chip in, to build the Besmedish, to build the Sefer Torah, or anything else. In those days, that's what they did in order to get Daled Minim. This week, Bez Hashem, I would like to continue on talking about the Lulav and Hadassim. Maybe we'll get to the sukkos also. So, it was a tremendous amount of money to obtain Daled Minim. And we know all the stories about how people sold a house and people saved up money their whole life to buy esrog. That's the Mitzvos was very expensive. What the Pella is, after looking into the subject, I'm actually very, very surprised and fascinated that even after so much Mesiras Nefesh to do the mitzvah and Daled Minim, they still, the majority or most of the time, still probably weren't mekayim the mitzvah of Daled Minim. Yes, you're hearing right. They still weren't mekayim the mitzvah of Daled Minim after all this Mesiras Nefesh. And the reason is because even if you have a kosher esrog, that still doesn't make the Daled Minim kosher. You still need hadassim, a lulav, hadassim, and a ravis, and they also have to be kosher. If one of them are not kosher, we pass that you weren't mekayim the mitzvah of Daled Minim. And along the generations, probably most of the time, definitely a big part of the time, Daled Minim was not kosher. You didn't have full kosher Daled Minim. Even if you had a kosher esrog, you're likely to your Lulavim and your Hadassim should be puzzled. So even after spending so much money and so much Mesiras Nefesh to buy Daled Minim, to chip in, to make for the Daled Minim, still there weren't mekayim the mitzvah Daled Minim. And this reminds me of what we spoke about in the past. The chazal say that when you go into Galus, we spoke about this Barichas and the Ramban and others, it's a Safri, that when you go into Galus, you should still be mekayim the mitzvah in order that you shouldn't forget it when you come back to Erets Yisroel. And the Rishayos speak about what it means, but really, it's very simple what it means, because obviously we're not talking about mitzvahs atluis ba'aretz, because that's you don't do chutz la'aretz. We're talking about mitzvahs atluis b'guf, which you mechuyev in chutz la'aretz. And even although that you weren't, you are mechuyev to be mekayim the mitzvahs, galus is a reason why we can't be mekayim the mitzvahs. It just doesn't give us the opportunities. It's not the weather, it's not the climate to be mekayim the mitzvahs that the Torah was given. The Torah was given for us to be in Erets Yisroel, to do the Torah in Erets Yisroel. And we spoke about this about Riches. And we're in Galus, so we have no choice. But we got to do the best we could, but not always is it in our hands to do it. And now, along the generation that they were mekayim Daled Minim, when Mesiras Nefesh, they were only mekayim the mitzvah, shlo tishtakach Torah's Daled Minim Yisrael. That's what's clear in the Poskim, that even if a lulav ayavish is puzzled, you're still allowed to use it. If I can't, you're mechuyev to use the possible lulav. Why? Shaloi tishtakach teres daled minim. You should not forget it. So we see over here clearly that we have to be mekayim the mitzvahs, even if not be mekayim it, not to forget the mitzvahs. Shaloi tishtakach teres daled minim. And that's what the Golus is about. Yes, sometimes we were able to, sometimes we weren't. But the matzav of Golus is a matzav of bittul Torah mitzvahs. And the kima mitzvahs was shloitish takach Torah mitzvahs. And that's what we plan to look into further. So we did the Daled Minim with the Esrog, we saw Shmesiris Nevesh. There was. Now let's go into start off with next with the Lulav. The Gemara said it's already, we find in times of chazal that it wasn't easy to be kind the mitzvah from Lulav. Always there were places that they weren't, they didn't have Lulavim. It's a Gemara, Meshach the Sukkot, Aflamat Allah from the Aleph, famous Gemara, that the Gemara is the Machlekes, Tanakama, and Yehuda, if a Lulav al Yavish is kosher. So Yehuda said, he brings a story, Maaseh b'bnei Krachim, let's go with a story with the people that lived in a big in the big cities, with which had walls around it, b'nei Krachim, Shayim Rishon, as Lulaveim, Lebnei, that they would inherit, they would keep their Lulav over generations, not only for themselves, for their children, and for their grandchildren. So you see that in the times of Rabbi Yehuda, I guess that was, not sure what this was, but there was, as Rashi explains, she'ein dorim al makim hadasim in the kulam mitzvos. It was in a place, maybe it was in times of Galus, I'm not sure, because Yehuda was in Erets Yisroel, but this was a place that that in big cities. Rashi explains that there's no pardesim, they don't have palm trees, and they didn't have lulavim, so they didn't have a lulav to shake, so they kept one for last year. Not only they kept it for this year, they kept it for the year, the next year, and for the future generations until the Einiklach. So we see that lulav wasn't always able to have. And again, it's shver because Rabbi Yehuda was in Erets Yisroel, and even although it was after the Churban, why wasn't there lulav? I don't know why. Upon him, that was the Mitzvos. We see in times of chazal that there wasn't always lulav. And that was Yehuda's raya. They allowed to make a bracha on Daled Minim, which are yavish. Kum the Rabbanan, as I say, there's no raya. Shasat Chak is different. Can't bring a raya for Shasat Chak. So they didn't have Daled Minim, so then you allowed to make a bracha. And this is the source. The Rambam Paskin's based on this. This is how we paskin, that you allowed to make a bracha on Daled Minim in a time that they're yavish, because although it's possible, and the Mordechai brings down from the Sefer Yereim that although we passled Yavish by Lulav and Hadas and Rava, Anan us Lulav and Hadas Yavation, we make a bracha on Yavation. And he brings out the Gemara we said before. Zok the Yereim, and the Mordechai quotes it, and it's quoted by Aguda, that the minig is to make a bracha on dry pasala lulavim. That although it's pasul, shasat chak, you let him make a bracha on these pasala lulavim, shloitish takach, teres daled minim. And this is brought down on Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch in Simon Tov Reish Mem Hey, Saf Hey, that the minig was to make a bracha on dry lulavim, and it's brought down. The Makar over there is from the Guy's Maiminus. And all this is Rishonim. The minig was to make a bracha on dry lulavim because they don't have anything else. They didn't have anything else. Just like it says in Yereim, Anan belulav hadas avachem eveshim shedloy efsha v'yishasat chak. There was nothing left, nothing else left. If you have one lulav that's not dry, no one's allowed to use the dry lulav. It's possible, and but because there was nothing around, there was semich hashasat chak, and this is brought down. The Ramah says he adds a few words. B'medinas eli she'en lulav mitzion He's talking about it in his place. These the words actually are not in the Goyes Maimis. Goyes Maimis writes that's our minig, and he adds in our city, in our places where the Ramah was, it's brought down the Lavush. They didn't have Lulav and and the Shulchan Charav also writes all these places along all the generations, they were all benching on a lulav apostle. There was nothing kosher about the lulav. Now it is brought down in Shulchan Aruch, quoted a shittus atosvis that holds only if you could if it breaks apart, if you touch it with if you poke it with your nails and it breaks apart, that's considered yavish. There is such a shitta brought down, but the poskim say that's not negay ladina. It was only taz, and the other poskim say that this is only brought down. The shittas atosvis is only brought down to be lamatzchus in the place that they don't have regular kosher lulavim. The Taisis shit is a very big chiddush because it's almost impossible to have such a dry lulav, and it'll never be dry. It'll never be possible al yavish. And that's what the place can say, that we don't pass like this. Taisis was just brought down to mechazik the minig to use dry lulavim. And the Sefer Yosef Oimitz also brings down, says this nekuda that we can't be simich in the Svar Yechidah, the Taisis is not lahalacha, and he says that if anyone could get a regular good lulav, that you should go get, you should try to get a good lulav. So that is the minig along generations, and this minig was until not long ago. It's brought down in the Adarim from Reb Chaim, from Chaim Gitar. It brings down that he remembers Reb Moshe Tendler said over from Moshe Feinstein that he was mated to use a lulav for 5 years straight. There was no deichik asha, and he was a rav in the Soviet Russia. He was mated to use a lulav for 5 years straight. And the Igros Moshe himself in Archaim Chelik Aleph Simon Kopei Daled speaks about how this year he'll be using a lulav from last year. He brings down his father also used in the past. He brings down Pam Achas, a lulav from last year, and that's why he writes to the shoyl that although you don't have a lulav from this year, you're still allowed to use the lulav from last year. And the Avnei Shalot Shuvas Avnei Tzedek also speaks about the lulavim that they're using from last year. So this was the Mitzvos all along generations, although they maybe had kosher asrogim, but they didn't have kosher lulavim. Now we go over to the next shmuz about Hadas Yavish, and the same shmuz repeats itself about Hadas Yavish. The Mordechai both say that the Goyes says it from himself that with Tzimich on the Rambam to make a bracha on a Lulav and a Hadas Yavish because we didn't have anything else. And the Mordechai brings down the Yerayim we quoted before, the Aguda brings down the Yerayim we quoted before, that we're noig to make on a Hadas Yavish, dry Hadasim, because there is nothing else. And the Moshe says the same thing also, that we're noig to, by Lulav and Hadas, we're noig to make a bracha on a Yavish because there's nothing else. Maril, how dry were the Hadassim? The Maril is a fascinating Maril. The Talmud writes this in the Sefer Maril, B'mei Maril Sagal, in B'medinas Reinus, there was no Hadas. There was no Hadassim in Medinas Reinus, where he lived. Only those that were brought by the Seicherim. And he used to bring bundles of Hadassim together with the Asrogim from Tzarfas, Spain. And he said that the Maril never opened up the bundles of Hadassim in order to check if the Hadassim were kosher, because there was a big kashash that the Hadassim were Hadas Shoite. We'll get to that next. And there was a big problem with the Hadassim that there were a lot of the Hadassim were apostle. They weren't even considered Hadassim. They were considered Hadas Shoite. And so he didn't check it. He didn't untie the bundle. Why didn't he check the bundle? Listen to these words. He never checked the aguda. It's impossible to check the aguda. Why? The bundle. To check if the leaves are kosher. Because they're so dry, yinashru kol ha'alam. All the leaves would fall off. If you start checking the hadassim and taking out one after one and checking going through it, all the hadassim will fall down. If you remind yourself of how the hadassim look when you go to burn it in the chametz, the minhag is to use it to burn in the chametz, and all the leaves you touch and all the leaves fall down. So too was the Maharil's hadassim in the time of sukkos. If he would just take out from the bundle and open it up, each hadas, look at it for itself, it was so dry that they would all fall down. That's how dry it is, and that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Shulchan Aruch says that in our Elia Medina's Naiga Mechala Psulim, that you make a bracha. You don't make a bracha on Esrog Yavish, but a Lulav and Hadas you make a bracha. Why? Most of the time, that if we wouldn't be able to make the Heilige Tanya, his whole life, he's saying like this, if we wouldn't be able to make a bracha on Pasal Hadassim, which are Yavish, most of the time, we would not be able to make a bracha on Daled Minim. You don't find any Lulav, any Hadassim, Lachem, they're all dried, crispy, dried. And that was the Mitzvos in those times. And they didn't have Kosher Daled Minim. Again, the Shulchan Aruch is clearly stating that most of his life he didn't have Kosher Daled Minim. The Chai Adam, the Chai Adam Mishbur brings down that he's speaking about over there Hadas Shaita, which we'll get through shortly. He says that from these Hadassim Yaveshim that they bring with the Esrogim, B'doichik nimtza echad l'meya sheyesh boy kan gimel b'kan echad. B'doichik do we find one kosher lila at a hadas which is not hadas sheita. These are hadassim yaveshim. They only bring hadassim yaveshim. That's the only thing that they had. And then even in those we find 1 in 100 that's kosher, which we'll get to right now. So that was the matziv of hadassim yaveshim in the times of the Chai Adam, all over wherever they were. Again, there was also Russia, but at least in these places, the Ramah was Poland over there. In these places, that there were no hadassim which were ksherim to use for lulav. Now the halacha is in the third perik, Masech Sukkah, that you need to have a hadas which has 3 leaves on one line, and that's what's kosher. If it doesn't have 3 leaves on one line, only 2 leaves and one higher than each other, then those 2, then it's possible. That's called hadas shaita. It's not only that it's a hadas yavish, it's not considered hadassim at all. And you're not allowed to make a bracha on those hadassim. Okay? So it's not considered a hadas. Hadas shaita is not considered a hadas. And the problem is, this is the Pashat halacha in the Gemara. And the problem is that most of the hadassim were hadas shaita. They were not hadassim. These bundles of, we just said over from the Chai Adam. We just said over from the Chai Adam that within the bundles of 100 a dry hadassim, there's maybe 1 kosher hadas which is not hadas shaita. B'toich eli aveshim shemim ha'asreg b'doichik b'doichik nimtza echad l'meya sheyesh ba gimel b'kan echad. It's doichik that we find 3 in 1 line. And the Beis Yosef brings down from Turis Hadeshem, simulation and tests. She'ein roiv oila makpidim hadas shaita. The most of the world was not makpid hadas shaita. They made a bracha on hadas shaita, and he's miskash, doesn't understand why the ganze arichas in Turis Hadeshem Ayin Sham, and the Beis Yosef brings down the same thing from Maharik al hadas shaita sheroiv dinas Ashkenaz yitzim boy. and he's v'heshiv shenivel ma'oid me'alzeh, and the Marik was mamash nivel mozeh, and he tried to be melamed sukkos, and he said you should not make a bracha on it. Mostly that's what he paskin. Yeah. So most of the Klal Yisrael in Ashkenaz did not have a kosher hadasim. Now, this is brought down in Shulchan Aruch. The Mechaber Paskins, again, the tradition is not Mekel. He says that's why there was such a minig around, and Marik is mishtadel to find limit chus, and he says it's possible, and the Mechaber Paskins it's a hadas shoyt and it's possible, and the Ramah adds a puzzle afil b'shasat chak. So the Ramah is being refreshed in the Mechaber the puzzle afil b'shasat chak. It would seem like from this that the Ramah is mefarish the Mechaber, that obviously he's going. This is the Pashas halacha that's possible for the Shasat Chak. But then he says man the Omer Gemara b'kud kosher. There is one man the Omer the Gemara that's kosher, and we're samich that man the Omer. Even though we don't pass like that, it's clear we don't pass like that man the Omer, but we're samich b'Shasat Chak on the shit which is not la halacha. I guess maybe to be make a bracha we're samich on him. I don't know. And then he brings the yesh mishakos of the hadas mishlon in the krum. That some say that our hadas are not das shaita. Why? Because this hadas was different than all the hadasim. Their hadasim were actually not das shaita exactly of the Gemara. There were two leaves on each line. It means the Gemara is talking about two leaves on a line and one above it. Over here, there wasn't even one above it. We know above it. We know hadasim that have three on a line. You use a dasim only, you have two on a line. So if it has two of a line, be the evidence kosher. And he says, that's why we're noig to mekel. Now, if you look at the Shulchan Aruch and all the places Shulchan Aruch deals elu she'ein hadasim she'er mitzim. The hadasim she'er are not motzi. We're noig to be varach on these hadasim. And he says that those that yashlam yalayim schus. And well, it's clear if you learn good Ramah. Also, you'll see that it's only a limit schus. It's actually not the Medina. And Mishmur says this already. I am bir agra b'shar acharim shekulam pikpikim ma'oid al miniga hish ein lahem shum yisoid. There's no yisoid over here. And the Ramah was deiching himself to make kind of minig. L'chein hayor dvar Hashem. He should be matrich himself to find kosher hadasim. And and the Chai Adam writes that these hadasim don't have cheskes kashrus until you soak it in water and to be able to check it. He says, so I left out a little bit from the Chai Adam about the yibeshus, how dry it was. He says, now most of the hadas, all the hadasim are yavish. Only one of them out of 100 is not hadas sheiter. He says, but how can you check it? Because if you're going to check it, it's going to fall apart. It's all dry, and you can't see clearly if it's all in one line. So he says you have to soak the hadasim and make them a little soft, and then you'll be able to check it. So you see how dry the hadasim were. Unbelievable. So what do we see over here? We see Ma'adik Zach. We see that in all these places, the hadasim were dry, crispy dry, and they were hadas shoita, and they weren't. Mamash hadasim was deichi gadol shver. All the places in Mishazach, how they were able to make even a bracha on these hadasim das shoita. Okay, it was a little sukkos how you can make a bracha, but ladina, it's not something to be samich on avada. If someone would make a bracha on these hadasim today, it would be considered a bracha levatala. You can't be samich on that anymore. Okay. Now, just to interessante Zach. So this was the Mitzvos all along generations. The hadasim were yerveshim and the hadas shoita. And then came along in the 16th century, they figured out how to make greenhouses. It was an expensive thing. It was, universities would have greenhouses next to them. We're going to import this type of fruit, and that type of fruit, and that type of tree, which only grows in warmer places, and we'll see how it works. That's how it was. The rich people had a greenhouse, and universities had a greenhouse, but it wasn't shchiach at all. But once there was certain places that had greenhouses, so they started being able to get locally kosher hadasim. Again, those were private greenhouses. They weren't made for public, I guess. It was rich people and universities. But if it was such a mitzvah, and so there was some available. Now these new hadasim, this were the shmuz in the Paiskim is about the hadasim, and the Shvus Yaakov speaks about these new hadasim, and he says he's choshed that it's a morkov, and he passes it. And all the Paiskim are up with this Shvus Yaakov, the Paiskim, that he passes these new hadasim al tzarkava. And he said that his grandfather passed like that, and he says we're soymich on the old hadasim, even though the yavish was soymich on it, like the Paiskim say that you're allowed to be soymich that because we don't have hadasim that are not yavish, we're soymich to make a bracha on them. Kum Chacham Tzvi, and he gets very, very upset with the Shvus Yaakov. Ein Sham very, very sharp words on the Shvus Yaakov, and he says that, and he says this is not, it's not a markova, and he says that the Shvus Yaakov thinks that his hadassim are only possible al yavish. His hadassim are not hadassim at all, because hadas shaited, they're not kosher b'chlal, and the apostle. And the Shvus Yaakov tained that what? Why didn't our grandparents use these hadasim? He says, what are you talking about? Why didn't our grandparents use it as the new hadasim? They didn't have greenhouses. We have greenhouses. This is something which earlier generations never even dreamt of. And he says, even now, only the malachim, the sarim have it, and you can't get it only b'domim and karim, b'shtadlus atzim. You have to b'shtadlus. Even now, it's very not shchiach. Maybe there are certain towns that can get one set of kosher hadasim. He doesn't have that. I'm adding that, but he says you need shtadlus atzim. It's very hard to get it, and you have to, and it costs a lot of money, and the hadasim which the Shvus Yaakov are using are not hadasim. They're not puzzle hadasim. They're not hadasim. That's shaita. Of course, they're all yavish. That's not what they're talking about. And he says, of course, you can use this. Our grandparents didn't have the exile to use these. They didn't have this mitzvos of these greenhouses. Gadlon oisem betachbulos gedolos etzuris merubis. It cost a lot of money to plant these things, and the big tereach and things our grandparents ashal leisharim avasenu. Yeah. And that's what he says, and he argues, and the Shvus Yaakov has tshuva against back, very sharp tshuva against the Chacham Tzvi, and he says, Ein Sham, I'm not going to go into the details right now, but you see over there how not shchiach was to have three. He says, yeah, we once got a das which had three in one line, and the Nesivis once traveled. It's brought down in the Shuvas Dvar Moshe, the Enikel. He says that his father told him that his grandfather, Avi Imoy, the Chavas Das, that he was when he was the Rav of Kalish, he would be darker because he would be matriach himself a lot and spend a lot of money in order to get before Yontif the new Lulav, he has over here Lulav and Hadas in order to be kind of mitzvah. And he said he himself traveled kama pasois in order to check out the paradise, in order to cut them by himself. And that was the matzav over there. That was the machlokes, a tremendous machlokes. Should we be matter these new hadasim and new lulavim in order to have something that's kosher? And we have to count our blessings that these were. That the Baruch Hashem wouldn't have these shilas and wouldn't have these machlokes, and everyone almost forgot already about the Egyptian Lulav, which we grew up with. We have beautiful, everyone became a Rosh HaKol. We have a beautiful Lulav, Rebbe Lulav, and we should be zeichen to be kind of and appreciate what we have. As Hashem next year I plan to give will be on the Mitzvah Sukkah, how our generation was zeichen to be kind of Mitzvah Sukkah, Kiroi, Mashenkin, the earlier generations. May everyone have a good Keben Shiur.